Welcome into a fresh episode of the College Football Insiders. I'm your host, Richard Johnson, joined by my guys, John Talty, Shehan Jeyarajah, and Chris Hummer. Guys, we got a 12-team playoffs field for the college football playoff. Not everybody's happy about it, but we do have the field. And the bubble discussion to end all bubble discussions has been, I'm not going to say quieted, but it is at least a made decision. Alabama in, Miami in, Notre Dame out, unfortunately, for the Irish. So before we talk about the fallout of this, and there has been quite a bit of fallout, Sean, I want to go to you first. Did the committee, in your opinion, make the right decision in how they constructed the bottom of this college football playoff field?
Yeah, I think that they did. I think that when you look at that Notre Dame versus Miami head-to-head, that's really something that's difficult to get over, right? I mean, you look at the strength of schedule of this Miami team, you look at the comparable losses. Like, this was a situation that I think had to be resolved this way. I think it would have been wrong for them to have done it the other way. Obviously, their process of getting there with the weekly rankings and changing things up at the last second, I have a huge issue with that. But you have Miami in the field, you have Alabama in the field. I think that these are probably the right calls, even if ultimately I think they took the wrong pathway to get there.
Yeah, Sean, the weekly rankings show is tough because it then involves a situation of people kind of following logic and what the committee has said for 6 weeks, but the committee is saying things based off of incomplete resumes at the time through 8 weeks, 9 weeks, 10 weeks, or what have you. I agree with you probably that they should just kind of give us a midweek check-in on where the rankings stand and then give it to us at the end of the season when everybody's resumes are indeed complete. Chris, obviously a lot of people are taking issue with the fact that Alabama is in and has not dropped a spot in the rankings, despite the fact that they didn't look so good on the field against Georgia on Saturday. Ohio State lost and dropped in the rankings. BYU lost and dropped in the rankings. But their losses, in my opinion, and their resumes, in my opinion, are differently constructed than that Alabama team. That Alabama team, yes, has embarrassing losses to Georgia and to Florida State earlier in the season, as well as to Oklahoma, but they also have really impressive wins. In my opinion, that's the thing that the committee kind of weighed and said, well, we have the 11 and 12 seeds locked because those are going to those two conference champions. And then we've made the decision between Miami and Notre Dame. And so Alabama and Miami as a binary, you probably have to take Alabama over Miami because of Alabama's total resume. Do you think Alabama in the field was the right call?
I think the arguments against Alabama in this field are pretty disingenuous, to be honest. I think it has a lot more to do with striking at the brand than it does the actual reality on the field. And I don't think it's rational to punish Alabama for losing the SEC championship game. The problem we have, I think, as an audience with Alabama sticking where it was, is how the committee handles everyone else. Like, if the committee is going to penalize Alabama or not penalize Alabama for losing in the conference championship game, it probably shouldn't penalize BYU either. And it's the inconsistency with the committee that I think sticks with people. So I think Alabama there is the right move. I don't think you can drop an Alabama team that beat Georgia earlier in the year on the road just for losing in this conference championship game. That's a way to devalue conference championship games in the future. But the process surrounding all of this, the explanation surrounding all this, I think is what's really frustrating for fans. And frankly, even for somebody like me who's trying to follow this and write about this, it is very difficult to keep up with what the committee is going to do from week to week because the committee isn't consistent from week to week. And I think that's the sport's biggest issue. It's obviously a TV product. It has to happen. But if you're going to be on TV, you need to be consistent about it.
Yeah, and I think it makes people feel like there isn't integrity in the process, right? It makes it feel like this is all made up, that it is manipulated for television ratings or things like that, which I generally don't think is the case. But when you start having people think that way, it starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, obviously, John, the team most aggrieved the day after the college football playoff field came out is Notre Dame. And the Fighting Irish have already started on the warpath in talking about the fact that they're unhappy, particularly with how the ACC has treated them during the process. My guess, and this is only my guess, that they probably didn't love the fact that the ACC network replayed the Miami-Notre Dame game ad nauseum last week on the network, for instance. But Athletic Director Pete Bavacqua yesterday and on Tuesday tomorrow, we assume, will take to the mic and say some pretty disparaging things, you would guess, about the ACC. And they seem to be kind of beating the drum about the relationship between them and the ACC overall.
I'll be honest, his argument does not resonate with me even 1%. I think it's pretty absurd, to be quite honest, that the Notre Dame AD thinks that the ACC would not fight to get one of its playoff playing schools into the conference. And it is especially noteworthy because their path was because Miami beat Notre Dame. It's not because they just randomly targeted Notre Dame. It's because those two teams played each other, and that was the best argument that Miami had to get in over Notre Dame. He's talking about, the value that Notre Dame provides to the ACC. Here's a fact. The football schools and the football generate about 85% of the value to TV partners. So at best, Notre Dame is part of that 15%. And when was Notre Dame basketball really relevant? It's been a long time. So I get that Notre Dame wants to throw its weight around and that they're mad that they got left out. But pointing the finger at the ACC, I think, is particularly misguided. And frankly, if they don't like it, they can try to find Power 4 games elsewhere. I think it's actually a pretty friendly deal to Notre Dame that the ACC has offered them, knowing that they're not playing football 100% with the ACC. So I think that argument is just frankly silly, and it's someone who's upset and just trying to lob bombs at people right now.
A friendly deal and a friendly schedule in the ACC, by the way, for Notre Dame.
That too.
When you consider Notre Dame, like Notre Dame likes to say it's independent. Okay, you've got 5 permanent opponents in the ACC. That, as Chris has stated, typically gives you a pretty fair shake. They have Miami, and then they have the other 4 teams that they played in the ACC, which are in the bottom half of the league. Then you have your permanent opponents in Stanford, USC for now, and Navy. And then you have your 4 out-of-conference opponents that you can schedule, just like pretty much any other school has out-of-conference opponents that you can schedule. To Notre Dame's credit, they do schedule with intent. I know Arkansas is not good, but was Notre Dame supposed to know that a few years ago? Wisconsin, who they play next year in non-conference, isn't any good, but it's not their fault that between the time that they scheduled that game and now, Wisconsin has effectively lost its football identity. So I understand that Notre Dame is going to have serious gripes about how people view their schedule, but I do think Notre Dame has a really, really decent shake with its schedule because of how things shake out. To me, though, at the end of the day, and this is where I think, Chris, your point about people following committee logic can be frustrating. I understand how people get there. Because at the end of the day, what really happened with the binary between Notre Dame and Miami is that they were too far away in the rankings for the head-to-head to be considered. So week after week after week, Notre Dame stayed above Miami. And I think in the initial rankings, they were like 5 or 6 spots away. They weren't close. And so they got closer and closer and closer as the weeks went on. And then on Tuesday, last Tuesday, when they put just BYU between Notre Dame and Miami, I said it on CBS Sports HQ, and I had an inkling. If BYU loses that game, they're going to do it, and they're going to finally judge their head-to-head. So, Chris, I think your point is well taken that, it can be frustrating to try to follow the logic when a lot of people, quite frankly, tune in for the first time yesterday to how they put this field together.
Absolutely. But I would even challenge the idea of finally getting them back to back and being able to compare them head to head, because I find that nonsensical. Like, you can't tell me just because BYU lost and you moved them out, now you finally have the opportunity to think about Notre Dame versus Miami, teams that played on the field earlier this season. Like, that didn't just occur to you, teams with the same record, same resume, really, like literally back to back in strength of schedule, both top 10 or metrics like FPI. That was the first time you could ever really think about them in the same bucket. That doesn't make sense. And I think when you talk to people across the sport, that's the issue right now. The communication coming from the committee, and this committee in particular, was just so confusing at times. It puts us in a position where, honestly, like, I think we could have saved ourselves a lot of these headaches if Notre Dame had just been ranked behind Miami 3 weeks ago. Like, Notre Dame would not be canceling its bowl game. And drawing a bit
let
of
me
a
jump
temper
in.
tantrum, to be honest. Yeah, sorry.
No, and let me jump in. Like ultimately, here's the thing, right? Like, there's this idea of the teams being comparable. This should not have happened just because they became back to back. There is no rule in the protocol that says teams only become comparable when they're right next to each other in the rankings. Heading into last week, the committee tried to tell us that they thought that Notre Dame was better than BYU, but Miami was worse. Well, BYU situation changed. How did that all of a sudden change, right? These teams were always comparable. And also, I've gone through the college football playoff committee's like mock selection committee. The way that you evaluate teams is in buckets, essentially. You look at them in groups of 6, and from the beginning, essentially, especially when they moved up to 12, Miami and Notre Dame would have been compared directly against each other during votes. This is not the first time that they would have been treated as like teams, as comparable opponents. So for them to kind of sit here and say, well, nothing changed about the sport, because you talk about the idea of having a final resume in place. Miami and Notre Dame's final resume was set last week. That did not change over the course of conference championship weekend. It shouldn't have changed just because some factors around them changed.
John, really quick, what do you think is the future of the committee and in the weekly kind of announcement and ranking setup and the way that they do that? Because I understand they're contractually supposed to do it week to week, but contracts can be changed when both sides agree that this isn't really serving either.
Well, I guess the question is it not serving? I mean, I think you can make the argument that maybe it's not serving the CFP's interest, but I'd argue it's working out pretty well for ESPN. We talk about it a lot. It leads to a lot of controversy, probably good ratings for them. So this is part of what ESPN has bought. It's overused at times, but it's the classic Mad Men quote. That's what the money's for. This is part of what they are buying with the CFP. And so if I'm ESPN, I want to keep doing it. It's great for me that people tune in on random Tuesdays and then leads to all of this, discussion at the end of things. So I can tell you from talking to high-level people at multiple different conferences, there are a lot of people who would like to do away with the frequency of these rankings. But ultimately, there's only 2 partners that truly matter. That's ESPN and CFP. We'll see if, whether some of these powerful conferences can push the CFP to move off of it. But right now, I don't see a change because for ESPN, there's no reason to change it.
When we come back on the College Football Insiders, we're going to talk about the team that the committee put number 1. How about those Indiana Hoosiers? Welcome back to the College Football Insiders. Guys, Indiana, Big Ten champions, number 1 ranked team in the country, number 1 seed in the college football playoff. The job that Curt Cignetti has done over 2 years, unlike anything we have seen in the history of the sport. John, I'll go to you first about how Indiana has been able to build themselves into this behemoth. You're somebody who's gone to Bloomington, who sat with Curt Cignetti, who's really kind of picked his brain and understood how he's been able to do this. How impressive has this been in your eyes for Indiana?
Yeah, I mean, I was there in Indianapolis over the weekend, and I think even the Indiana fans were stunned that this was a real thing, right? I mean, could you imagine 2 years ago saying that Indiana was going to beat Ohio State in the Big Ten championship, that they would be the number 1 overall seed in the CFP, and that they have a quarterback who has a extremely good chance to win the Heisman. It's an unbelievable turnaround. I think people like me would love to write books about what Curt Cignetti has done at Indiana. It's truly an incredible story. And I think there are a couple things. One, clearly Cignetti bringing so much of his staff and players from James Madison got them off to a great start last year. We saw that. It gave him a great foundation. He's had people that have been with him all the way back to the IUP days, the Elon days. They've worked their way up together. That includes offensive coordinator Mike Shanahan and defensive coordinator Bryant Haynes, who had a terrific day, I think, Saturday against Ohio State. So that's been part of it. And then clearly, I mean, Cignetti's an incredible mind. He is a great offensive mind. He knows how to recruit. He's been involved in it back to the Nick Saban days at Alabama. He's very hands-on in how they put together that roster. And it's worked, in which it's a tough-nosed group of kids. They've added the right pieces like a Fernando Mendoza. And think about it like this, Richard. It's gone so well, so much better than expected. Just imagine what's going to happen now that Indiana is a national player, the kind of recruits that they're going to be able to get in the future when they have mostly relied on transfers and 3-stars type guys to this point. It's unbelievable to imagine that the future might be even brighter moving forward for Indiana under Curt Cignetti.
Chris, particularly the portal players that John is talking about that are on this roster make it really go. Obviously, you have to start with Fernando Mendoza and, Curtis Rourke on last year's team. He leaves, and then they're able to honestly level up at the quarterback position. What is it about the way that Indiana goes about their business in the portal specifically that was able to keep this going and get this team, quite frankly, better than last year's team. It was last year that they really could not compete in the trenches against the Notre Dame, against this same Ohio State team in the shoe last year. But then they come out and they beat Oregon earlier in the year, and they beat, obviously, Ohio State on Saturday night.
Well, I think they do two things really well. One, evaluate. You're talking about the trenches, but I'm just going to pivot like briefly to a guy like Roman Hemby, who's their starting running back. He was the guy at Maryland that had been pretty successful for a couple of seasons, had kind of tapered off late in his career, and he had one more season to go. Indiana identified him, and he's been one of the best running backs in the Big Ten this season. And you see a commonality there with Indiana. The guys they go and identify in the portal, their staff there does an excellent job on the evaluations type things. On the evaluations tend to work, but also like give that staff some credit, man. Like they coach the hell out of these guys. Like you don't win at Indiana. It's not like Indiana had like a top 10 transfer class this year. They're like going and identifying the right guys, but they're also getting the most out of them. Like Fernando Mendoza is significantly better than he was at Cal last year. And he was really good at Cal. And you can find improvements like that across the lines of scrimmage as well. Their strength and conditioning coach, Derek Owens, is one of the most respected names in the country at his position. He's one of the youngest as well. Like there are guys across that staff that do an excellent job. And there's really no rational explanation for Indiana doing this. This is the losingest team in college football history. At least it was before Kirk Singletary got there. And now they're the best team in the country. And that has everything to do with development, and it has everything to do with evaluation.
Indiana actually lost that losingest team in FBS ignominious distinction earlier this season when it became Northwestern. Shehan, Indiana, again, #1 seed in this tournament. How far do you think they can run in this thing? Can they win the national championship?
I mean, we just saw the odds up there, right? They're #2 right now, only to Ohio State, who they beat, by the way, in odds. So they absolutely have the upside of doing it. I mean, look at the field right now. There aren't perfect teams, right? There aren't obvious teams that are just going to turn it on that a team like Indiana can't hang with. And I think the other thing, too, that's going to be really interesting is their path. I really am going to be fascinated if we get that Texas Tech versus Indiana matchup. You know, it's going to be such a great defensive battle in so many ways. But I mean, look, Georgia's looked flawed this year. Obviously, they beat Ohio State and managed to expose some stuff. Oregon, they just beat earlier this year, if that's the team they end up playing. So there's no team that they should look at and be afraid of in this field. And like Chris mentioned, I mean, that's a testament to the development that they've done. That's a credit to the schematics that they've put forward. And I think that almost it's become an inefficiency to become like just a great football staff, to be able to go out there and run good practices and make guys understand their roles at a high level. So I think this is absolutely an Indiana team that should be up there with the top contenders to win the national championship. And I'm sure that that they're going to be a factor well into the postseason.
Richard,
Yes.
can I ask you a briefly nerdy question, Richard? I'm just curious for your perspective on this. They play base defense more than any team in the country that I watch week to week in terms of having 3 linebackers out there. Like, what do you think that philosophy does for Indiana?
I think from a philosophy standpoint on defense, it allows, well, I will say, how good they are up front allows them to continue to do that. Ohio State shredded Michigan last week, Thanksgiving weekend, rivalry weekend, because Michigan wasn't able to devote the bodies to coverage that they otherwise would be able to if they were really, really good up front, right? Michigan last year, for instance, was able to handle with Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant up front. They were able to handle Ohio State, and they were able to double Jeremiah Smith, double Emeka Egbuka, and they were able to really tamp that Ohio State offense down. They weren't able to do that in the game this year because they weren't that good up front. So you take it to the Indiana game, the Big Ten championship game, because of all the things that Indiana does up front on the defensive line with its movement up front, and just the fact that they are really, really good physically, they can only rush 4 for the most part and get home, or at least affect Julian Sand, which they did so many times in that game. That allows them to do a lot of different stuff in coverage, and that allows them to be able to devote more bodies to the coverage. But when you talk about personnel, you know, you didn't mention that they use a lot of nickel. It's 3 linebackers up there. They're just physically good. I mean, they just kick butt up front, and they're able to get away with it against the teams that they have played just because they are, frankly, physically superior, Chris? It's a really, really good question, a really, really good kind of insight into what makes Indiana tick.
Yeah, nobody can run the ball against them for a reason because they have three 230-pound guys flying around that you can leave on the field at all times. And it's just a very rare thing in this era of college football. And I think it defensively, especially, really contributes to their success. It's one of many reasons, obviously, but I think when you're looking for something to differentiate Indiana from everybody else in the field, like that is one of the big areas.
And I want to jump into just let me say too, I mean, I think that also the ability of D'Angelo Ponce to go out there and man up so many of the best receivers in college football. Like when you have a mismatch like that, when you have a guy who can hang, it just changes the way that you're able to attack even some of these high talent teams.
John, imitation, the sincerest form of flattery. There are going to be a lot of teams that are going to try to chase their version of Curt Cignetti in the college football coaching carousel. They are well at work doing that. UCLA, obviously, probably the clearest example because they just got Curt Cignetti's successor at James Madison in Bob Chesney. Shehan just made a great point about how, Indiana's just competent, well coached, good scouting, good developing, and good deployment. Is that a model? It's obviously easier said than done. Is that a model for a team like UCLA, for instance, to go from, decent kind of average Power 4 program to playoff contender?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Indiana and Curt Cignetti have shown that anything is possible, right? And I think it's not solely just them, but I think it's the way the game's changed. I think it's when you look at the recruiting rankings, it's seeing how the talent is better dispersed now than it has been in the past. So there's these ability for teams to, I think, level up and rise up with the right amount of investment, infrastructure, and of course, the coaching and development. And so I think Indiana kind of nailed all of those things. I think certainly UCLA, hiring someone like Bob Chesney is very exciting. I think the question I have is that UCLA traditionally has not invested to the level that they've needed to, has not had the behind the scenes help that you need. Is that going to be fixed to allow someone like Bob Chesney to really flourish? Certainly, he believes that it's capable. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken that job, given that there are going to be other opportunities for him. But that's ultimately the thing. I think everyone right now is saying we're going to pour more money into it. But if everyone just adds more money, then that advantage kind of disappears a little bit. So I think school you're seeing is we're going to put more money into it. Okay, money doesn't fix every problem. You have to have the right people and the right plan as well. And so I think it's going to be much, much, much easier said than done to replicate what Curt Cignetti has done at Indiana.
When we come back on College Football Insiders, Penn State finally lands a coach. It's Matt Campbell. How do we think about the search, how it ended, and what Matt Campbell can do in the job? Next. Welcome back to College Football Insiders. Guys, Penn State has finally found a coach. It was a winding search that took over 50 days to conclude, and quite frankly, almost sounded like it was going to end with Kalani Sitake in the end. But no, Matt Campbell, Iowa State, I guess we can call him coaching legend, quite frankly, is making the move to Penn State. Sean, I know you're a guy who's really in on the intricacies of not just Iowa State, but also BYU and kind of how those two things ended up. What do you think first and foremost about Matt Campbell and his chances in this job?
Yeah, very bad process, very good result. I think that Matt Campbell is obviously a coach that has had a lot of success over the years. People are going to look and see and say, oh, he's a coach who wins 8 games. He was at Iowa State. Iowa State is one of the toughest jobs to win at in the history of college football. In fact, I went and calculated he won 56% of his Big 12 games. Over the previous 10 years, they had won 25%. So this is a coach that's leveled up. He's won at a high level. He won 11 games for the first time in school history at Iowa State. And this is, I think, a hire that's going to work out really interestingly. The big thing that people are going to wonder with Matt Campbell is, does he have the ability to elevate and punch up? Well, I believe that I saw the stat that he's 4-7 against top 10 teams. And that's at Iowa State, a place where you're not really supposed to win very many of those games at all. So I'm very excited to see what Matt Campbell can do with those extra resources. He's been very selective about job processes. Obviously, he was involved, it was reported a while back with the Detroit Lions. He's been tied to other jobs around college football, but he was always waiting for the right one and the right opportunity. Penn State, I think, is a perfect fit for him.
John, before we kind of go nuts and bolts into the search, I do want to stick on Matt Campbell being Penn State's guy. Shehan just kind of brought it up. This punch-up factor is going to be, quite frankly, the thing that we're going to judge Matt Campbell in this job. It's going to be against Michigan and Ohio State and Oregon and USC, the top of the Big Ten. It's can he win those games, not just can you keep the floor stable. James Franklin kept the floor extremely stable at Penn State right until he didn't. It's the reason he was out of the job. I think Matt Campbell does keep the floor here stable, but do you think he can win the big games?
I think it's a real question, and I think the question in how this all works is just how does he handle the new expectations, the new pressure that comes with being at Penn State, and specifically how does he level up his recruiting and things like that. Remember not long after the Penn State job opened, talked to someone close to Matt about whether they thought it would be a fit. And the one thing this person brought up to me was that, Campbell really did not have to mess with NIL and the portal that much at Iowa State, certainly not to the level that he would at Penn State. And that's one of the things that he liked. And I think it's one of the reasons why you saw him mention much more prominently with NFL jobs than college jobs recently, because he wouldn't have to deal with those things at the NFL level either. He is very much going to have to deal with that at Penn State, especially if they are able to compete with Ohio State, Michigan, Oregon, some of those other Indiana top of the level Big Ten teams. So that's a question for me as to how that works. But we know he's a good coach. We know that the floor is high. I just know that when that job opened up, I'm sure you guys heard this too, like Penn State's kind of their level of what they're looking for is a national championship caliber coach. Is Matt Campbell that? Maybe. I wouldn't say he has proven it to this point. It would take him himself leveling up with the resources now available to him at Penn State.
Chris, the front office structure, maybe we don't have a clear answer on what it's going to be, but John just said that Matt Campbell would be a guy who would, I don't know about thrive, but it would at least be kind of have more proclivities to an NFL setup with the GM, and so he doesn't really have to do the dance with donors and NIL and this and that. How do you think this is going to be set up in Penn State in order to try to get him success?
Yeah, well, Matt Campbell's had a really good kind of director of player personnel. I don't know his exact title at Iowa State. I think it was associate director for player personnel, Derek Horger, who is going with him to Penn State. And I would imagine he sets it up in a pretty similar way to what they've had in Ames the last decade, if he has a choice. Like they've been ultra successful at what they do, which is identifying undervalued players and developing them over time. They knew exactly where they were supposed to recruit. They recruited big bodies from the Midwest. They brought them in, they developed them. They found inefficiencies at places like tight end that other teams in the Big 12 weren't recruiting and got the most out of them. I think they've had one of the best tight end rooms and one of the best linebacker rooms in the Big 12 for basically like 5 straight years now. And they've also found receivers, which is something that, frankly, James Franklin struggled to do during his time at Penn State. So I think they're well equipped to go in there and structure it how they did at Iowa State and be successful. The question I'll have, and I think the question we all probably have a little bit of, is how do they deal with those like high level recruiting battles that they haven't had to get into? Like you swim in much different waters at Penn State than you do at Iowa State in terms of who you're competing against for players, how much you have to deal with NIL, and in fairness, like they've done a pretty good job with that. Like a guy like Dom Orange, who was a all Big 12 defensive tackle on the roster, has been poached. Teams have been trying to poach him for 3 straight years, and they held on to him every year. So they have managed to get things done. I don't know what it'll look like with better resources, but I think the structure is there. The talent on the staff is there. It's just a matter of how they can scale up and if they can break a glass ceiling that, frankly, Matt Campbell also never managed to break at Iowa State either.
John, this search was wild. I mean, it frankly was extremely quiet for a while, and that's how, to my understanding, AD Pat Kraft wanted it. He wanted to kind of move in silence. But to be honest with you, as far as my understanding is concerned, it was quiet because Penn State was acting like it had their guy, and that guy was pretty much going to be Kalani Sitake. I think that Kalani Sitake was extremely close, as close as it can get to leaving BYU to take the Penn State job. But in the end, with money and with the ties that bind him to BYU as a former player and a devout Mormon, Sitake stayed. And it ended up causing a reset in Penn State's search. So, yeah, good result, as Shehan said earlier. But, John, pretty bad process overall.
Yeah, I was just going to say Shehan nailed it earlier. Like, if all you care about is the result, I think Matt Campbell is a good result. If you're more of a Nick Saban type and you care about the process, then this was a bad process and was a mess. I think throughout the process. I mean, I know from talking to plenty of people during the industry over the course of this, 54 days, is that what it was? Consistently heard back, I don't really know what Penn State's doing. And so I think the fact that they turned to Matt Campbell at the very end is a great way to salvage what was looking like I a complete mess, and I think there was real questions as to where they were going to go. It was left open enough that you were seeing that player push for Terry Smith as well, which I think would have been a real tough one to try to sell to a fan base after firing James Franklin. So I like Matt Campbell. I think he's actually a better fit than Kalani. I had real questions about how that was going to translate from BYU to Penn State. Matt Campbell makes more, geographic sense, more of a personality sense, I think, at Penn State. So it worked out, I think, in the long run for Pat Kraft, but it's hard to argue. Actually, I would say it's impossible to argue that this was a good process to get to that point.
Shehan, let's put on our fantasy hat here for a little bit. How would Penn State Kalani Sitake head coach have worked out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question, right? Because obviously, I mean, I know from talking to you and some of y'all, like, we didn't necessarily think that this was going to be real until it looked like it was going to become real. But here's what I'll say about Kalani Sitake is that I think he's one of the great coaches in the sport. He does a great job of building cultures. He's done a great job of identifying talent, both in the coaching ranks and in the player personnel ranks. So I think that he would have had a really good time transitioning over to Penn State. Now, the thing is, he's never coached east of Utah. Obviously, Penn State a little bit further east than that. He hasn't had to swim, like we've kind of talked about, in those elite recruiting waters. You're kind of recruiting in a different kind of way at BYU. But I think that not just with his interest in Penn State, but also the concessions he got from BYU, I think that that's kind of an indicator that he's ready to do so. We're going to get a chance to see him with higher level resources, even at BYU, to have them be involved in elite recruiting battles. They just brought in a top 20 recruiting class headlined by five-star quarterback Ryder Lyons. So I think that certainly he would have had the ability to level up like we're talking about with Matt Campbell here. But I mean, again, it is a different way of doing things. He's been primarily in religious environments and LDS environments, even when he hasn't been at that school specifically. And I think that there are complications, certainly, with trying to institute a culture like that at a secular school.
Chris,
Real quick.
I was going to give it to you anyway, Chris, because honestly, this is a Penn State program that signed, what was it, 2 players on signing day? I think when we look at the task for Matt Campbell and that front office, it's going to be portaling. It's going to be portaling heavy. Look, this was a roster with plenty of Sunday players on it, despite the results by the end of the season. They are going to have to find a way to continue to level up and fill it with a whole lot of portal parts here in January, Chris.
No question. Before they re-signed Terry Smith, I was texting with an agent who certainly has a lot of ties around Penn State, we'll put it that way. And I asked him, like, how many of the players on the roster currently do you think stay if Matt Campbell is hired and Terry Smith isn't? And he put it at 80%. No, 80% would leave. Like 20% would stay, 80% would leave. That math shifts quite a bit with Terry Smith being retained. I think there's a reason why Terry Smith is now the highest paid assistant coach in the country. Like, that roster was going to fall apart if he wasn't there. So I don't think the rebuild is going to be quite as extensive as it would have been had Terry Smith not been retained, but it's going to be a big one either way. Matt Campbell's going to have to come in there and build from the ground up. James Franklin's going to try to raid that roster. That's just the reality of the situation. And Matt Campbell's going to have to hold on, and he's also going to have to find value other places while they try to do this on the fly. It's a very difficult situation, and it's kind of ironic because Penn State was looking for a coach to push it over the national championship hump. But I think at least in the short term, this basically takes Penn State out of the national championship conversation for a few years, just because of what this rebuild is going to look like.
When we come back on College Football Insiders, we're going to talk about some more of the coaching carousel and some of the best coordinator to head coach pairings that we've seen so far. Welcome back to the College Football Insiders, guys. It's not just the coaching carousel at the head coaching level. It's also at the coordinator level, which will define, obviously, what we see on the field next year. Let's talk about some of the newest coach coordinator pairings that we are going to see in college football next year. John, DJ Durkin ain't the head coach, but he is sticking around at Auburn under new head coach Alex Golesh.
Yeah, this is a unique one where a guy who was clearly a successful defensive coordinator at Auburn, to the point that he was a very, very serious candidate for that job up until the very end, that Alex Golesh would keep a guy who wanted his job. That's always a unique setup. And that was something that also created a situation where Auburn wanted to keep DJ Durkin, played a factor, I think, in John Summerall ultimately going to Florida instead of Auburn. So it's kind of an interesting setup, but Durkin's clearly one of the best defensive coordinators in the country. He had multiple opportunities elsewhere, including at a place like Mississippi State, which, shout them out for a second. I think Mississippi State did a very good job adding Zach Garnett, previous head coach. That's also kind of a weird, unique setup to bring a guy back who had previously been the head coach, but thought that was a good move for them not getting DJ Durkin. So both of those are kind of weird setups, but I think both Auburn and Mississippi State made good defensive coordinator hires, which is important, of course, with them being paired with offensive-minded head coaches in Alex Golesh at Auburn and then Jeff Lebby at Mississippi State.
You want to talk about bringing a guy back? I mean, James Franklin's defensive coordinator is going to be Brent Pry. I mean, he didn't even sell his house. Doesn't even have to take his kids out of school. Brent Pry, former head coach of Virginia Tech, obviously, because of his previous relationship with James Franklin from back at Penn State and at Vanderbilt. It was my understanding that Pry kind of held out to see if there were going to be any head coaching opportunities that may have been able to shake loose for him. Obviously, he was fired so early in the cycle at Virginia Tech. But he ends up being James Franklin's defensive coordinator. It's a weird one, and it had been weird throughout the time that I and colleague Matt Zenitz had sort of been tracking it throughout the coaching cycle. You've seen these things happen a little bit. Vance Joseph with the Broncos, for instance, is back as defensive coordinator, and Sean Payton. Like, it's happened here and there. Bobby Petrino, for instance, at Arkansas. But I don't know that it's ever happened immediately, that the guy immediately fired just sticks around. So for me, Brent Pry, defensive coordinator for Virginia Tech, and I almost misspoke and called him the head coach because it's just, to me, so bizarre in how it ends up. And so that was honestly, my biggest coordinator move. And again, you can't even really call it a move because he's just shift his stuff down the hall. That's going to be tough for him, I imagine, because he's probably had that corner office for so long in that building. Now he's got to go down the hall into a coordinator office. That's going to be tough for Brent Pry, I would imagine.
Well, Richard, I wonder, both with Arnett and Pry, it probably impacts their buyout payment, right? Both those guys are getting checks from those schools, are now getting another check. I'm curious how they figure out the math on that.
Yeah, it is going to be really interesting how that one shakes out.
I will also say with that situation, and I have another coordinator in a second, it is worth noting that James Franklin, for good or for bad, potentially, depending on your view as a Penn State fan for his entire career, has been incredibly loyal to his assistants over time, like the people who's worked under him. And this is yet another example of that. I'm not saying Brent Pry is a charity case by any means. He's one of the best defensive coordinators in the country. But it is worth noting that, once again, James Franklin is going to a comfortable place for this hire. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's going to ultimately work out really well for Virginia Tech and probably helps them retain a bit of talent. But it is very interesting to note with James Franklin moving forward. This is something he often does. I did want to briefly mention the offensive coordinator situation at Kentucky. Will Stein hired Joe Sloan, the former LSU offensive coordinator, to run the show there. I think it's a very interesting situation. Will Stein has already said publicly he went there to be a head coach, not to call plays. He wants to be the best head coach he can be, not the best play caller. Hiring Joe Sloan, somebody who coached a Heisman Trophy winner just 2 years ago at LSU, is a splash move. It'll be interesting to see what Kentucky offensive football looks like moving forward. I don't know if y'all feel the same way, but it has been a painful process having to watch Kentucky play offense for about the last half decade. I think that might shift a little bit under Joe Sloan's direction as a play caller. And I'll be very curious this offseason how they build that roster out around the offense that Joe Sloan wants to call.
Yeah, Shehan, when we talk about coordinator moves, you were mentioning, obviously, Eric Morris comes to Oklahoma State from North Texas. We'll see if Drew Mestemaker is going to come with him. You'd imagine that Eric Morris is going to retain sort of control of that offense. But on the defensive side of the ball, he is pairing with somebody interesting.
Yeah, well, look, I think that the numbers don't necessarily do justice to what Skylar Cassidy did at North Texas this year, but he really was a huge part of them going from a bowl contending team to a conference title contending team. He did a fantastic job, especially with the pass defense when he came over as defensive coordinator at North Texas. They ended up top four in passing defense in the American, which again, if you saw North Texas 2 years ago, you'd understand how much of a leap that is. And he's also somebody who was on Casey Keeler's staff, a defensive coordinator at Sam Houston as well. So, again, I think that it obviously is familiarity for Oklahoma State and Eric Morris going with the coordinator who was with him at North Texas. But I think that it also will help bring some consistency. This is a coach who's been around the state of Texas for a long time, even though Oklahoma State is, of course, an Oklahoma school. They live in Texas, especially in recruiting. And I think the big thing as well is, I mean, you look at Eric Morris, he's putting together a very young, hungry staff. We've talked a lot in the past about the general manager over there, Raj Murthy, as well, only 24 coming over, going to be a huge part of building that program. I think it says a lot that they're staying with a lot of the same personnel in the coaching staff that they've had, but with a crazy amount more money to work with at Oklahoma State.
Hey, by the way, the numbers do bear out how much better North Texas was defensively this year. They were 107th last year before Cassidy took over in yards allowed per play. They were all the way up to 44th this season, despite the fact that I don't, remembering the transfer portal last cycle, I do not believe they had more than 2 defensive tackles on the roster by like April 15th. They had to like rework that entire room. Skylar Cassidy is somebody who, throughout his career, has done a great job. He's on my 30 under 30 list a couple years ago. His brother actually used to play for Oklahoma State, so a lot of familiarity there. He's one of the up-and-coming coordinators in the sport.
When we come back on College Football Insiders, we're going to take you to the transfer portal and talk about the most impactful moves we've seen so far. Welcome back to the College Football Insiders. Guys, got a few minutes left. Let's hit on some of the most impactful things that we've seen and will see in the transfer portal era. That means we got to go to our guy, Chris Hummer, who knows everything ins and outs of what's going on in the portal.
Yeah, that's a generous thing for you to say, Richard, but there's a lot going on at the moment. I'm going to take y'all through a couple names that I think are really important to know as the cycle progresses over the next couple of weeks that all kind of happened today. So Matt Zenitz broke the fact that Harvard quarterback Jaden Craig is entering the portal. Nobody probably knows who Jaden Craig is talking here, but like, this is somebody that scouts view as a legitimate NFL prospect. I think several big name teams could have him on the radar as a portal name at quarterback. I think he's somebody you really do need to introduce yourself to. He is a guy, if he left this year, would have been drafted. So pay attention to Harvard quarterback Jaden Craig. Notre Dame quarterback Kenny Minchey is entering the portal, the backup to CJ Carr. He almost won the starting job this year. He's also a guy who's going to be a P4 starter at the end of the season. Earlier when we started the show, I announced that Jaheim White at West Virginia is going to enter the portal. He ran for 900 plus yards in 2 seasons at West Virginia as an underclassman. Had 3 touchdowns in 2 games this year before suffering a torn ACL. He's going to be a very popular name in the portal. And then Sam Levitt watch still continues. Chris Cartman at our Arizona State site at 24/7 Sports reported that Sam Levitt was the only team captain not to attend the team banquet. Kenny Dillingham had a very vague statement where he said he wishes him well, whatever his future may hold. Everybody in the country really expects Sam Levitt to be a guy who goes in the portal. So that's just a guy to keep an eye on right now.
Yeah, the other big one, obviously, that we saw over the weekend, new Cal head coach Josh Lapoy, first order of business, making sure Jaron Keavi-Segapolitelli is going to be sticking around. That had to happen. He was going to be somebody that was going to be highly sought after by pretty much every school in the transfer portal if he were to have gotten in it. But it was massive for Lapoy to retain JKS. All righty.
Watch Nick Rolovich to stay on that staff, too, with JKS staying there.
That is true. Thanks for joining us on this episode of College Football Insiders. For my guys, John Talty, Chris Hummer, and Shehan Jeyarajah, I'm Richard Johnson. We'll see you later in the week.